Canada, what they've done to our dairy farm workers is a disgrace.
Just as that man feared Canada imposed a 300% tariff on American cheese and deeply cut dairy import quotas right when the world was waiting to reach agreements with the US. Within days, hundreds of containers were returned, domestic shelves flooded with discounted cheese. But no one told you those were leftover stocks previously rejected by foreign markets. Americans are becoming the landing zone for their own products, as farmers go bankrupt, factories shut down, and retired consumers living on pensions are swept into the whirlpool of cheap but questionable cheese. And if just one tightening blow from Canada caused the US dairy industry to lose $3 billion, what will happen when the whole world starts turning its back on American food? Watch the video. Canada crushes us. Dairy exports. Trump freaks over $3 billion. Cheese collapse. If you still believe the food on your table is always protected. Canada takes action, cutting quotas, raising tariffs. But everything had been brewing long before. In the scorching heat of July, as many American families struggled with rising electricity, fuel, and food bills, unexpected news from the north startled many in the agricultural sector. Canada announced it would tighten imports of dairy and cheese from the US. They not only drastically reduced the allowed import volume, but also raised tariffs sky high up to 300% on shipments exceeding the quota. It may sound like something far away on negotiation tables, but in fact, this story directly affects the very cheese you, an ordinary consumer, put into your shopping cart every week. Canada claims this move is to protect domestic farmers, especially at a time when many industries are suffering from global economic fluctuations. But if you've ever heard the term supply management system, you might better understand why things have come to this point. Since the 1960s, Canada has had a mechanism to stabilize its dairy farming sector by limiting domestic production and controlling imports. Their goal is to avoid overproduction and free-falling prices, a problem farmers in many parts of the world, including the US, frequently face. In fact, this mechanism has long been a controversial topic in numerous international negotiations. Some American politicians have protested, claiming it blocks US goods from entering the Canadian market. But from a farmer's perspective, many Americans actually wish their country had such a system where production isn't left unchecked and farmers aren't swept along by risky price fluctuations. Since the USMCA trade agreement was signed, the US has been allowed to sell a small portion of dairy products to Canada tariff-free, only about 3.6% of the total market. But if this limit is exceeded, tariffs soar, sometimes up to nearly 300%, making actual sale prices far too expensive compared to domestic goods. And the problem isn't just the numbers. Many US businesses report difficulties in accessing this quota because Canada's allocation method mainly favors domestic companies. And this July, when the quota was cut further, the consequences quickly appeared. Some shipments of milk, butter, and cheese from the US were sent back from the border. Many containers sat in warehouses with no destination. Domestic milk prices began to fall due to a sudden supply surge. Some small farms in Wisconsin and Idaho were forced to sell at a loss, and some even dumped milk because they couldn't sell it. Statistics show that just last year the US exported nearly $900 million in dairy products to Canada. Now, every returned shipment represents lost revenue and vanished hope. Meanwhile, American consumers continue shopping as usual. They only notice some types of cheese at more attractive prices in supermarkets. But has anyone told them those cheeses might be leftover stocks from rejected shipments? Has anyone explained they've traveled a long journey, been deep frozen for preservation, and may be close to expiration? No one warns them, no one questions it, and no law requires such disclosure. You might think this only concerns farmers or big companies, but in reality it affects the entire supply chain, from farms, transport companies, supermarkets, to the end consumers. When exports are blocked, they have to turn back, and then the domestic market becomes the only outlet, regardless of quality, regardless of the original reason for rejection. The dairy industry, though an essential part of daily meals, is rarely mentioned in major economic discussions. No flashy factories, no high-tech appeal, no media allure. But that's precisely what makes it so vulnerable. While sectors like electric vehicles, semiconductors, or oil often receive protection, and investment dairy, with its diligent farmers, herds of cows, and morning cheese deliveries, quietly bears the brunt. America breaks down, cheese gets returned. Consumers become the dumping ground for leftover stock. The moment Canada announced tighter quotas and higher tariffs on dairy imports, chaos didn't unfold on TV or at press conferences. It began right at the border, with trucks loaded with cheese and butter from Wisconsin and Idaho. Shipments that seemed certain to clear customs as usual were suddenly blocked and sent back. No clear explanation, just that the quota was full. Permitted but not permitted. That's how this policy works. But the more painful part came afterward. With no way to export cheese and milk returned with nowhere to go. Some small farms had to dump milk straight down the drain, no compensation, no accountability. Farmers could only watch their hard work flow away with the wastewater, while supermarkets announced cheese 50% off. Consumers felt happy seeing discounts thinking they'd snagged a deal. But in reality, they were becoming the final dumping ground. They had no idea the products they were eating had been rejected by the market. No one told them, no label said so. And that's what erodes trust. Major industry players like Tillamook, Land O'Lakes, or Kraft were also hit hard. Storage costs rose as containers got stuck with nowhere to go. Trucks had to haul goods back to cold storage, then circle again and back again. Each loop added more costs. But companies couldn't speak out, fearing damage to their reputation. So who bears all this? Consumers, you. States like Wisconsin, Vermont, and Idaho began demanding government intervention to buy up surplus cheese for free distribution to low-income households. But the proposals weren't approved. Meanwhile, the U.S. Dairy Council sent urgent letters to the White House warning that without immediate action, the entire dairy sector could lose its recovery momentum. By mid-2025, direct and indirect losses had already exceeded $7 billion, a figure that cannot be brushed aside as a minor issue. Amid this confusion, Americans began looking north to Canada. In Canada, things are playing out very differently. Dairy there is strictly regulated antibiotics, and growth hormones are absolutely prohibited. What the US FDA still deems acceptable is outright banned north of the border. Not because they want to make life hard for farmers, but because they prioritize public health and food safety. You see, the dairy industry in Canada isn't just about farms, it's an entire ecosystem. Supporting jobs from packaging, distribution to research and education have helped thousands of rural businesses thrive. Major universities like Guelph and Saskatchewan run world-leading programs on animal welfare, nutrition, and genetics, all rooted in the dairy sector. They do this not because of empty patriotism, but because they understand protecting farmers means securing food security for their people. Canada doesn't let farmers go bankrupt because of falling prices. They don't let cheese quietly flood supermarket shelves as leftover stock. They don't let consumers eat what others have rejected. They may be strict, but they are transparent with their citizens. Canadians call this policy Canada First. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because Americans once had the same slogan. Yet ironically, while Americans talk about protectionism and self-reliance, Canada is quietly putting it into practice. They protect their market, protect quality, and most importantly, they don't let their people bear the cost. And the most painful thing isn't the billions lost. It's the fact that Americans are forced to eat cheap cheese because they have no other choice. Farmers are forced to sell at a loss because no one stands up for them. They don't need a new trade war. They just need a fair, decent system where sweat and labor aren't wasted, where products aren't treated as surplus trash. When you walk into the supermarket and see cheese on discount, you might feel happy. But ask yourself, what are you really eating? Who is truly paying the price? And why is what Canadians have something we can only dream of? Europe, Japan, Australia following suit. America is gradually losing export markets. You may have never noticed, but when you drop a piece of cheese into your shopping cart at the supermarket, the outside world is quietly making a decision whether to continue buying American cheese or not. After Canada's tightening measures, which seemed at first to be just a minor bilateral trade crack, that crack has now widened. Now it's not just Canada shutting its doors. Europe, Japan, and Australia, former loyal customers of the American dairy industry, are all simultaneously considering a similar path. Not because they hate American cheese, but because they've begun to ask, is this still a product we can trust? Since May, the EU has been quietly consulting on adding a series of American agricultural products, including milk and cheese, to the list of retaliatory tariffs if the US refuses to make concessions in trade negotiations. By July, this list had reached $72 billion, and American cheese was one of the clear targets. They're not making noise. They're not staging press conferences at the White House, but they are taking action. And step by step, American cheese shelves in Europe are at risk of being replaced. It doesn't stop there. Japan and Australia, two nations with open trade agreements with the US, have also begun re-examining their agricultural import standards from America. It may sound like a big political matter, but in fact this hits directly at the daily lives of ordinary Americans. Farmers who rely on export orders to offset losses in the domestic market now have to watch blocks of cheese being returned. Consumers like you, like me, will see on shelves aging cheeses with declining quality or cheap products with strange tastes. Not because we've changed our taste buds, but because the rest of the world already has. Meanwhile, Canada, with its strict quality control system, domestic market-first policies, and unified messaging about consumer protection, is being seen as a model. Europe and Japan may not openly declare they are copying Canada, But the way they adjust taxes, scrutinize quality, and strengthen product inspections, all are moving in that direction. Behind every decision to tighten imports is a system at work. They are not doing this out of hostility. They are doing it because they are asking what protects our farmers better, what makes our people trust what they eat every day. And from that perspective, Canada, Europe, Japan, or Australia all share a common path to protect their people's dining tables first. What about America? What can we do to rescue the dairy industry teetering on the edge? America rescues its dairy industry. But is it too late? Since Canada tightened imports and American cheese began piling back into the domestic market, the whole system from the federal to state level has been forced to react urgently. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has reactivated the Dairy Farmers Income Insurance Program, a familiar but long-term measure insufficient to immediately address the ever-growing inventory in major production states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, or New York. Some agricultural industry experts have begun mentioning the possibility that the federal government might need to launch an emergency bailout similar to what happened in 2018 when agricultural products couldn't be exported. Proposals revolve around the government buying back surplus cheese, investing further in cold storage infrastructure, and distributing it through food assistance programs. However, to date, no official announcement has been made. Everything remains speculation within internal consultations. While waiting for a central response, many states have tried to cope in their own ways. In Wisconsin, state legislators are reportedly discussing plans to use local budgets to purchase cheese and distribute it to schools or food banks. This approach both helps avoid waste and supports low-income individuals. But due to the lack of coordination with the federal government, its effectiveness remains limited. This situation also places pressure on financial institutions within the agricultural sector. Some major entities like CoBank and Farm Credit System are said to be considering extending loans or easing credit conditions for affected farms. But access to such support is still not easy, especially for small farmers, those who rely solely on their 2 daily milkings to cover every expense. What many fear are all these rescue efforts coming too late? According to data from the International Dairy Foods Association, within just the past 2 months, the American dairy industry may have already lost nearly $3 billion due to rejected exports. And this is only the beginning. As Canada, the EU, and possibly Japan or Australia are all putting American cheese on the sensitive list, the future of the industry is no longer merely about pricing, it's about survival. Some analysts warn that without solutions to stabilize exports or restructure the domestic market, the American dairy industry could witness a wave of production cuts and subsequently widespread bankruptcies within the next 6 to 12 months. These impacts won't stop at the farms. They will ripple through the entire supply chain, from processing plants, cold storage workers, refrigerated truck drivers, to even packaging companies. All could be affected in turn. And what about consumers? We are not the decision makers, but in the end, we are the ones who bear the consequences. Right now, you might be able to buy cheap cheese, but if surplus goods continue to flood the market without strict control over quality and origin, it could directly affect every family's meals, especially those who need high nutrition products for their children or the elderly. And when trust in the quality of American goods is shaken, it's not just an industry crisis, it's a crisis of trust. The final question isn't who's right, who's wrong in this US-Canada dairy dispute, but are we, the American consumers, being protected, or merely the final link in a chain of political reactions beyond our control? You might think this is just a temporary clash between governments, but are you ready to eat tomorrow's breakfast with a piece of cheese no one dares to guarantee the origin of? If everything is upended over something as simple as milk, what do you think will come next? This video does not promote division between nations or encourage confrontation. All content is presented for the purpose of exploration analysis and sparking discussion based on current events, emotions, and social trends. We respect international law, trade agreements, and all United States federal regulations.
This video does not promote division within the United States or encourage litigation. All content is presented for the purpose of exploration, analysis, and fostering discussion based on current events, public sentiment, and social trends. We fully respect the United States Constitution and all federal regulations. If today's analysis made you think, drop a comment so we can keep the conversations going. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you will never miss our next independent deep dive.